one feels that bad. Yeah. They say life will bring discomfort, and I discovered we all just suffer, 'cause no one feels that bad. And it comes from one another. We hurt each other just like a lover, and don't think twice about that. Yeah, and I feel like something's bad, but hell, I'm used to that. I always turn my back, yeah. And I wanna feel something, but all I feel is pain. I wanna make a change, but you either pick yourself up or you let yourself down. Life will always be tough, so who the fuck are you now? Will you make it alone, or do you need someone else? I don't need anyone, I'll do it all by myself.
Hey.
I've got scars, put up my guard. I don't wanna get torn apart. I start to feel my heart race faster, it's pumping hard, and all I want.
How's everyone doing tonight? I'm not 100% sure what we're watching tonight, to be honest with you. I just watched two things that I thought were real interesting. I kind of want to comment on them. But I don't know. Just as I got into the right mood, my wife called and we had a little argumento. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Let's see. Let's go to watch later. Anybody else into fashion? I'm into fashion. All right, we're going to start off with Ruslan, and then we're going to go into what if. Then we're going to go to what if, I guess what ifism, and then we're going to go into something else. So give me a second.
I know the influence, I know the impact, and I know the vibes. And the girlies love the vibes, and that's just what it's.
That controlling the weather is. Hurricane Helene was absolutely devastating to thousands of families, essentially leaving what seems like entire cities underwater. But with the rare occurrence of a Category 5 hurricane following shortly after Hurricane Milton, many skeptics are just asking questions. Is there something more nefarious at play here? Now, to get the answer to that question, it is essential that you watch this video till the end. I don't often request that in these videos, but today I'm making an exception.
Now the claims are getting even more bizarre. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, a congresswoman of Georgia, is now saying the federal government is literally controlling the weather. We're controlling the weather. It's beyond ridiculous. It's got to stop.
Listen, after seeing Biden respond the way he did to that claim, it definitely makes the people who are saying these things online sound not as crazy. And in fact, what if I told you that controlling the weather is actually something the government has been...
See, it's this kind of stuff that makes Christians and religious people in general sound crazy. This is not smart.
Experimenting with and being transparent about it for years. Well, in this video, I have a few different clips that we're going to go over that highlights the possibility of this being a reality. We'll explore the implications on if the possibility of this is or is not true. I'll save my opinion towards the end of this video, and we'll look at one practical takeaway that every single person watching this video can take to help the situation. But before we get into that, guys, my name is Ruslan. This channel exists to encourage, empower, and inspire you to live a life that blesses God. If you're new here, or if you're not new here, so when I first started seeing this stuff floating around on X and Instagram, main thing I thought about instantly was what I had been learning about Dubai. This is a video from several years ago from Global News that explains how they've been, quote, seeding the clouds there for quite a while. Check this out.
More snow, more rain, or smaller.
That's all fine and good and dandy, but the United States would not, the government would not purposely create a hurricane to damage itself and its own citizens and then refuse to send funding to its own citizens. You'd have to have way more proof before you come out and do something like this or say something like this. This is just speculation without proof, and it's a bad look on us.
Hail pellets.
This is done by introducing a seeding agent through pyrotechnic flares attached to an aircraft. Think Roman candles with a mission to deliver those condensation nuclei that encourage more collisions and group huddles by ice crystals inside the cloud. Common seeding agents used are dry ice, the solid form of carbon dioxide, silver iodide, or simple salts like sodium chloride.
So that's pretty crazy if you think about it. It seems like they're utilizing these different compounds, something as simple as salt, and having that be let out in the atmosphere, in the clouds, influences the weather, or some may say directly controls the weather. Now, this has led to not so good situations in Dubai, which I think may set the precedent for what some people could be thinking regarding the last 2 hurricanes that recently impacted the country.
Parts of the United Arab Emirates were overwhelmed with the heaviest rain ever recorded there. Areas are still flooded days later. Some reports blamed a method of making rain called cloud seeding. The rains began late Monday. 24 hours later, more than 142 millimeters had fallen. That's 50% more than the annual average.
It was absolutely horrendous. It's the worst I've ever seen it in Dubai. And we've seen some bad storms in the past, but this was like nothing else.
It's horrifying. In Southern California in early 2024, the answer may lie in a program that uses man-made weather modification to increase precipitation. Last year, Southern California water officials announced a 4-year pilot program aimed at increasing precipitation by 5 to 15% for the year. The program's plan was to release silver iodide particles into the atmosphere. In the interview, that they even have to course correct live in the recording.
This could change your life. Let me tell you how.
Researchers are looking at how to change the weather on purpose. That's right. Lasers now could one day manipulate rain and lightning. CBS This Morning contributor Michio Kaku is a physics professor at City College of New York. Professor,
nice. Again, America didn't purposely create a hurricane to hurt itself, let alone 2 in a row. Now, is it possible that someone else did? Or that experimenting with it went wrong? Possibly. Is that likely? No.
To see you. I mean, lasers really to change the weather?
That's right. Well, as Mark Twain once famously said, everyone complains about the weather, but no one ever does anything about it. Well, instead of doing a rain dance, we physicists are firing trillion-watt lasers into the sky to actually precipitate rain clouds and actually bring down lightning bolts.
Okay. So we know that there is this whole seeding and letting off salt in the atmosphere to create precipitation. This dude is talking about a laser.
Again, laser.
Okay, just to be clear, this is not that new technology. Like, they were talking about this in the 90s on like Discovery Channel and the Nature Channel. So this is not that crazy. And this kind of conspiratorial thinking is a word that YouTube doesn't like.
Seeds. These seeds can also be created by laser beams. By firing trillion-watt lasers, we rip apart the electrons, creating what are called ions, and these ions act like seeds, like dust particles, bringing down rain and even lightning.
Okay, so he's talking about seeds here as well. I wonder if the laser is shooting up salt, or it's just a different process. It sounds like a different process altogether, but yet it's coming back to the same idea of seeds. So I'm not fully tracking. This is above my pay grade, if I'm honest with you guys. I'm just presenting the evidence, all right? Don't shoot the messenger.
Well, this fascinates me in part because, too, I remember reading the stories that China had used this during the Olympics, that the USSR had used this after Chernobyl to create rain clouds. I mean, did those really work then? We have some of these capabilities now?
Inconclusive. Even in the 60s,
Inconclusive. That's, He said, now listen to what he says about in the 60s.
Even in the 60s, the CIA used this to bring down monsoons during the Vietnam War to watch out the Viet Cong. Governments have been playing with this thing.
Alleged to.
Alleged to, right.
Oh, guys, catch it? Alleged to. I think he's letting way too much go in this conversation, right? He said that as a matter of fact. So when you start talking about CIA and using this sort of technology, not today in 2020, which we talk about it today, and we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, deserts need water. We're going to control and help influence the weather for more participation. That sounds fairly noble. He's talking about it in the context of the Vietnam War, and the reporters there, rightfully so, probably to cover their own butt, said, allegedly. Okay, maybe you're still not convinced that this sort of technology exists. Okay, well, let me present to you the director of the CIA confirming that they're going to be using this. And again, under the guise of helping the environment because of all the stuff that's been happening with sea levels rising. And
I don't
Earth getting warmer.
understand
Check this out.
why
Another example-
the neo-evangelicals and the fundamentalists are so scared of helping the environment. Literally, one of the commands from God in the Bible is to be stewards of the environment. So why are they scared of climate change and global warming? I don't get these fears. They're ridiculous. This is completely ridiculous. Okay.
Is the array of technologies, often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, a method of seeding the stratosphere with particles that can help reflect the sun's heat in much the same way that volcanic eruptions do.
Okay, so this is not the lasers that the physicists just talked about. This is coming back to the idea that we opened with, which is releasing this sort of stuff in the atmosphere.
SAI program could limit global temperature increases, reducing some risks associated with higher temperatures and providing the world economy additional time to transition from fossil fuels. On the geopolitical side, the technology's potential to alter weather patterns and benefit certain regions of the world at the expense of other regions could trigger sharp opposition by some nations.
He's saying this could lead to global conflict.
Please wait 1 minute.
I hate these commercials.
Okay, so I told you guys that I would save my thoughts till the end of this video. And in a moment, we're going to look at a passage of scripture that I think beautifully summarizes all of this. Okay, so let me just say this. It seems like the technology to pull this off exists. I think you'd have to be completely naive to say that it doesn't exist. But the idea that this technology is being used right now.
So if they actually had the technology that was workable to, at will, create rain cloud and showers, they would use it for farming. That is what they would use it for. The fact that they don't use it for farming or agriculture means that the technology does not exist in the form that you think it does. In other words, it cannot be used at command on a civilian level or commercial basis. That doesn't mean they're not experimenting with it. It doesn't mean there's not advances in it. It doesn't mean that it hasn't existed as a theory and as a potential technology for a very long time. Yeah, we can seed clouds and create rain, but we can't do it at will. We can seed clouds and create lightning, but we can't control it all the time. And we don't have good uses for it yet. And again, just because we're experimenting with it and just because the technology exists and just because we can do things with it, even if it's not completely developed in the way that they would like, doesn't mean that they created a hurricane to hit themselves with it.
This is the theory that's being presented. The theory that's been presented is because there's an election going on, they are using this technology.
That is a very hard R word that I can't say.
To create power outages all over Florida to hurt their own citizens so that they can keep Florida from going out to vote because Florida has turned red. Trump needs Florida to win the election. That's the theory. Now, what do I think of?
That's stupid. And that's very irresponsible to spread.
About this? Here's what I think about this. Clearly, this technology exists. Clearly, it is possible. I don't know if there's documentation that this can cause a hurricane or two hurricanes back to back, but I don't think that that's necessarily outside of the realm of possibility. But here's what I do think. The idea...
This is reckless speculation, and this is going to hurt, not help, when it comes to getting people to vote for the Republican Party.
The 3 weeks prior to November 5th, they, probably the DNC, causing this to happen, thinking that this would actually help Trump lose, is a completely asinine and backwards position. This is what I mean.
Yeah, but you just spread it as if it was facts. You get people to watch you, and people who turned off now think you believe that. This is irresponsible, and this is reckless, and this is feeding into a conspiracy, because some people will not believe you just by the fact that you said it. They're going to think the other thing is true and think they're getting a secret message.
If you look at what's actually happening on the ground, if you look at what's happening in Asheville, North Carolina, if you look at the response from the federal government right now, the fumbling of FEMA, they're not doing a good job. All the photo ops, all the goofiness, I don't think they're doing. I think they're doing what they can, but you're seeing a better response from like the governor of Florida, if you will. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is this is the type of thing that's an October surprise that doesn't get the Democrat elite, they, to win the election. This is something that they just completely fumbled, if this is real, and didn't do it nowhere near the time you would need people to be without power so they couldn't vote, so they could turn Florida blue. That's why this is all happening, so they could turn Florida blue so people couldn't vote. I think this is completely miscalculated. I don't think this is going to sway the election because I think it's too far from the election. And additionally, if this was calculated, they wouldn't have fumbled the FEMA rollout. They wouldn't have so many people.
This is conspiracy-minded. This is craziness. Even in the denial of it, it's still craziness. This is not responsible journalism. This is not responsible media. This is bad.
Not being able to get help. You got more churches and people on the ground in communities actually helping people reportedly than you have FEMA getting in. We're getting...
No, you just begin with, hey, this is a crazy thing. Don't think this is happening. Don't buy into it. If there's more proof later on, the technology that for the potential for this kind of stuff to happen is there, but it's not at the level, at least as far as public knowledge goes, that it could create this kind of unmitigated disaster. That's it.
Reports of people saying that the
Don't
resources
the
aren't coming out to
craziness.
certain parts because the roads are closed.
Why is that showing that?
Welcome back to Shameless Potpourri. I'm Joe Heschmeyer. So I'm doing a little bit of a theme during Easter where I just unpack particular arguments for the resurrection rather than...
Yes, I'm subscribed to fashion magazines and fashion blogs online. I have a long love of fashion. One of my best friends in both junior high and high school were both fashion models. And one of them went so far as to get a career that landed her in as a PR agent for a football team. She worked with guests for a while. She got to eat lunch with Cindy Crawford. She got to do really cool things. So, yeah.
Looking at the whole case, it's going kind of piece by piece. So 2 weeks ago, it was a simple case for the resurrection, which I looked at what are the alternatives to the resurrection. Last week, I looked at just one piece, St. Peter's testimony about the empty tomb in Acts 2, with the argument that Peter is saying this only 50 days after Easter. Peter focusing on Paul, and particularly not just the empty tomb, but the resurrection appearances of Jesus. And pivotal to this is what's sometimes called the Corinthian Creed. And the Corinthian Creed, as the name suggests, is this passage in 1 Corinthians where St. Paul seems to be quoting something. It's now lost to us, but it was apparently a creed used by the early Christians. Now, when I say it's now lost to us, I mean itself is very, very old. Maybe 51 AD. But the Corinthian Creed, as we're going to see, even skeptics tend to say this is probably within weeks, months, maybe a couple of years of Jesus's death. So that's what makes this complicated, because without having the original creed in front of us, there's going to, even when you hear that or when you're reading that, it's clear that part of this is what he's received. But in other words,
not docket.
the creed, you'll see these happen in chronological order, that they aren't just randomly assembled events, that you have Jesus' death, his burial, his resurrection, and then the resurrection appearances seem to be in chronological order. And St. Paul is very explicit about his own conversion, his own appearance, the appearance of Jesus to him as last of all. So Paul is presented as old as Paul is presented it as, that it appears to be from is from the early 50s. The appearance reports may well have originated a few days or weeks or months after Jesus' death, presenting this thing that he takes as a given. I think that's fantastic evidence, because he's pointing out something that's really important. You've got two things. First, as I said, you have
So he's claiming, because we're going to watch another video by Joe Heschmeyer in about a minute. But in both videos, he seems to make the same mistake, which is he's making a claim that the claim is evidence for an early dating, or at least evidence that it's true, but that's not what it's evidence of. The fact that there's a claim is evidence that someone believed the claim and reported the claim as true. So it's not as bad as hearsay as some secular skeptics might want to say, but it's still not physical hard evidence. And because at most you have 5 authors affirming this, you only have 5 witnesses. At most. That's assuming they're not synonymous, and that's assuming that they're not all referencing the same single source. So if they're all referencing Q, well, then you really only have one source for this. So this is not great evidence. This is evidence of belief. This is evidence of possibly true belief, but it is not evidence of the event itself actually taking place. I could see a dragon right now and tell everybody about it tomorrow, and then people who follow my channel could tell people, hey, he saw a dragon, and we really believe that he thought he saw a dragon. They could even say, we believe that he saw a dragon because we believe him. But that's not evidence for an actual dragon. That's evidence for my belief that I saw it, or more broadly, it's evidence that other people believed that I believed that I saw it. So it's not getting to proof. And again, better than simple hearsay. This is not, oh, someone said a rumor and then the rumor was spread. This is the direct line. This is Paul saw something, he reported it, other people agree that he saw it. Fine. So you have 2. You have Luke and you have Paul himself. That's not a ton of evidence. That's 2 people's opinions.
Treat the historic event of St. Paul's conversion as critical for making sense of this story. Paul can't be inventing this later on for a couple of reasons. Number 1, because his conversion was very public. Number 2, because he converted to something. And if there's no belief that Jesus rose from the dead, what is he converting to? What is it he's claiming to see? In other words, hopefully that makes sense. That Christianity is distinct. It's a distinct movement from the very beginning because it claims that Jesus, the Messiah, rose from the dead. This is its distinguishing feature as far back as we find it, and he becomes convinced of its truth. And he has a story for why he becomes convinced of its truth, but we won't even talk about that. Well, he was. But then over time, silly kind of pious devotions make him more like a demigod until people ultimately are claiming he's God, and then he rose from the dead and all of these things. So if you've ever seen or watched or read the Da Vinci Code, there's an argument like this. It's like Jesus originally was just a moral teacher, but by 325 at the Council of Nicaea.
This is a straw man. He's picking the worst possible argument. That's not the strongest. He's not steel manning. He's straw manning.
The bishops get together in forms of Buddhism. And so you get religious art, like the Bodhisattva takes 7 steps and declares he's the elder in the world, in which you imagine a newborn Buddha coming forth from his mother's womb, taking 7 steps and declaring this like special role for himself. Or you have all sorts of religious art about him descending from heaven or being declared a future Buddha by one of the prior Buddhas. And that this is not some later development over the course of a few centuries. If he's still in the tomb, a lot of people within 2 years of Good Friday are still going to remember where Golgotha is. I mean, we know today where Golgotha is. We know where the empty tomb is. And so you could just walk over there and say,
that's disputed.
Yeah, all this bit in the creed about him rising from the dead and appearing to him. But who those people were and all of this, some of them were apostles. But then there's this really cryptic line about...
So going back to the previous one, you could just make the argument that Christians went and got the bones and hit the bones. Because if there's bones, there's evidence that he didn't resurrect, and that negates the whole thing. You use Occam's razor, and you have a plausibility for, yes, the crucifixion happened, but that's how you explain away the resurrection if you don't believe. Now, the 500 witnesses, this one's more, this one's on far more shaky ground as a claim.
He appeared to 500, right? So what's that about? Well, I mentioned Richard Carrier, and I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that this is a part of the Corinthian Creed he rejects. He just has a theory that this couldn't be true. He says, I suspect verse 6 originally says something like, then he appeared to all the brethren together at the Pentecost, and not then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at once. And then he also claims in verse 7, the appearance of James and the apostles looks like a post-Pauline Scrabble edition, as it breaks the logic of the sequence and is too redundant, just repeating the same information already conveyed in verses 5 and 6, since everyone who saw Jesus was already an apostle, and James the pillar was already one of the 12. Let's talk about both halves of that. The appearance of James and the others. This is not a reference to the 12. There are a bunch of guys named James, and the apostles is a broader group than the 12. So this is referring to a broader appearance. But nevertheless, that's not really where my interest is. My interest is in the appearance in verse 6 about this appearance of the 500. Now, Carrier's argument is that Paul is like rewriting this and that it originally said that Jesus appeared to all the brethren together at the Pentecost. Now, what's the problem with that? Christians never claimed Jesus appeared on Pentecost. You know, think about Peter's Pentecost sermon. If Jesus was there on Pentecost, you don't think he'd be like, and by the way, not only is he risen, he's right here with us. That doesn't happen at one time. Most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Now, the most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep is almost definitely added by St. Paul. It doesn't make sense to say that at the time, but this is a reference to the fact that there not only were resurrection appearances, but that even 20 years later, as St. Paul is writing about this, a little under 20 years later, most of those eyewitnesses, or many of those eyewitnesses anyway, are still alive, are often dating.
So they're dating this to 50. I think I've heard people give the date of 70, 60 and 70, 65, 70. So.
Dated after 1 Corinthians. Now, I don't see the place relay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. Okay, so this is a foretold resurrection appearance. So they depart, and they're going on their way to encounter the disciples and tell them all this.
So
and
this
then Jesus surprises.
Video is a little bit outdated, even though it's a brand new video. Mythicists have kind of been debunked by the.
Welcome back to Shameless Popery. I'm Joe Heschmeyer. So Christians often present what's called the trial.
Mythicism has been debunked already by actual legitimate scholarship. So this is kind of more him shadow boxing, warming up, possibly even sparring for something that he's building up to. Or he's simply building a repertoire, and that means that he has to go through all of the arguments, including the ones that are already defeated. This would just be him moving up the ranks, as you will. I'm a little hungry, so I'm going to get some popcorn. I'm not going to put an intermission screen. I'm just going to leave it here, but I'll be right back, guys. I'm going to get some popcorn. I'm hungry. I got some water here. I'm also very tired. I had bad insomnia yesterday. And then my wife tried to have a fight with me right now, and I didn't take the bait, but I still think I'm going to have to deal with the fallout after the stream is over. Give me a few seconds. Oh, I bought some comic books today. I've been hearing good things about Absolute and about All In on DC. I haven't heard any good things about the Marvel stuff that's going on right now, so I'm hesitant to buy anything from Marvel, but I did buy the Blade #1 because I like Blade. I want to support it. I want to buy some classic 1980s Punisher collections too. I'll be right back. I'll be gone for about 2 minutes. I'm out of popcorn, guys. This is a hard day for me. I might have to, after the show is over, go to the convenience store and pick up some popcorn. Oh, it's going to be hard. It's a long drive just for popcorn, but that's okay. How's the sound? How are we doing on sound? Okay. And we continue.
Dilemma. That Jesus speaks in such a way that he declares himself to be God, which leaves us with three possibilities, sometimes shorthanded to Lord, liar, or lunatic. Either he's totally out of his mind delusional, or he's knowingly lying about being God, or he actually is God. Now, some atheists will object to that, or non-believers more broadly, and say, I reject that whole trilemma.
There's also a quadlemma, which is he's just delusional.
I don't think Jesus existed or said the things he's ascribed to saying. This is what's sometimes called...
Again, there's a better solution. I mean, if you just want a simple solution, he was insane. Or delusional. He doesn't have to be a lunatic. He could just be delusional. He could just be wrong. There's a fourth one for you. He's wrong. Liar, lunatic. Lord, liar, lunatic, wrong. Fifth one. Lord, liar, lunatic, wrong. We misunderstand what he said. So yeah, this, yeah. Sixth one. Lord, liar, lunatic, he's wrong. We misunderstand. Or misattribution of what actually happened. So here's what happened. Then they restructure it to now into the developed theology that comes later.
Jesus mythicism. And I want to answer two versions of that argument today. One version says, literally there was no such person as Jesus of Nazareth. The other version says, yeah, sure, there may have been a Jesus of Nazareth, but he didn't do all the things ascribed to him, and the things ascribed to him are based not on the life of Jesus, but on Roman mythology, and well, Greco-Roman mythology, that's then being brought into Christianity. Now, if you've never heard those objections before, then I encourage you to buckle up, tune in, and see kind of how we
If you've never heard those objections before, you must be new to the internet.
should respond to those. Because there are good answers to those, but I think a lot of Christians are so ignorant of Greco-Roman mythology that it's easy to kind of fall for these false objections. The stronger, the more extreme of the two is the first one, that Jesus literally never existed. The most famous proponent of this, even kind of cautiously, was Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion. He doesn't endorse it, but he kind of throws it out there. He says it is even possible to mount a serious, though not widely supported historical case, that Jesus never lived at all, as has been done by, among others, Professor G.A. Wells of the University of London in a number of books, including Did Jesus Exist? Now, you'll notice he doesn't exactly come out and say this is true, but he does claim that a serious case can be made historically. And then he quotes a professor. Now, if you know nothing else, you might imagine this is a history professor or someone with a relevant kind of degree in a relevant field who's teaching on that kind of subject. None of that's true. G.A. Wells is George Wells, who is a German professor. And it's true, early on, like in the 1970s, he did make the argument that Jesus didn't exist. But even Wells realized that argument didn't hold water, and so by the end of his life, he admitted that there was a Jesus of Nazareth, and he retracted his earlier kind of skeptical views. So the one guy who's being cited as scholarly support by Dawkins reneged on that. He retracted. He doesn't think the thing Dawkins ascribed him as saying, and didn't think it at the time Dawkins was ascribing that view to him. Now, John Lennox pressed him on this, his colleague at Oxford. I think Lennox is a mathematician, so neither of them are like classicists or historians or theologians or anything like that. But Lennox actually asked the people in the relevant...
Those are all... So, if someone has a decent objection, it doesn't matter if they're not specialized in a particular field of study. None of that matters. These are deflections, and they're also... There's not so much poison in the well, but... It's like saying a question isn't qualified because the person asking the question hasn't studied. That's asinine.
Fields, and realized nobody believed the thing that Dawkins was claiming. And so he pressed him on it, and surprisingly, kind of got Dawkins to admit that he was wrong about the whole Jesus didn't exist thing.
You say that it's under scholarly dispute among historians that Jesus actually existed.
This is a good gotcha, by the way, on Dawkins.
Now, I checked with the ancient historians. That is not so. And it disturbed me. History is not natural science. But what I don't understand is this, why you would write something like that.
I don't think it's a very important question whether Jesus existed. There are some historians, most historians think he did. Some
They
historians
certainly
don't.
do. I couldn't find an ancient historian that didn't.
Well, there are one or two. When you look at history, and let's leave aside, maybe I alluded to the possibility that some historians think Jesus never existed. I take that back. Jesus existed.
So you'll notice Links presses him, and Dawkins backs down. He says, oh, there are one or two. He can't name them, he doesn't cite to them, and then eventually he's just like, yeah, Jesus existed. Now, when he's not being pressed by someone who knows the relevant area, he'll still vaguely refer to some unknown scholars out there who side with this view that Jesus didn't exist, but he's careful not to give us any clues as to who they are or what they've written or whether they still hold that view. Do you think he was a real person?
Most of the scholars I've talked to say he probably was. The evidence is not great, of course, but I think I don't think it's that big a deal, actually, because a wandering preacher called Yeshua or Yehoshua would it not be surprising? I mean, it's a common name, right. And there are plenty of wandering preachers. What would be very surprising would be if he raised Lazarus from the dead and walked on water and turned water into wine, and that, of course, did not happen.
So you'll notice Dawkins is still kind of hemming and hawing. Oh, most scholars think he existed, like leaving open that maybe there's some scholars who agree that Jesus didn't exist. He doesn't really cite them. To the best I can tell, the closest you're going to find to any kind of scholarly support is Richard Carrier, who does not work in academia, but has a PhD.
There's been more than a few people in MythVision who don't think Jesus existed, and more than a few people on some of the other atheist podcasts. I'm thinking here of Atheist Republic, but there's one by that guy who's real belligerent. I can't remember his name. Yeah, so I mean, there are mythicists in the world, and a lot of them are educated. That doesn't mean anything. But you don't have to downplay it this hard. But the gotcha that he put on screen, even though he did do some tricky editing with it, was pretty good on Dawkins. I mean, that's good. That's a good rebuttal.
In his defense. And Carrier has some pretty wild views on Jesus' alleged non-existence. He's easily the most famous mythicist because he's extremely online. And he says things like, whether there was a historical Jesus or not, the earliest Christians believed he was an extraterrestrial who descended from outer space and then reascended into the stars to communicate with them beyond the grave. That's an outrageously inaccurate view of the New Testament account. But he goes on to say, once we accept this, the proposal that Jesus never even...
It's not that outrageous. It's a reinterpretation of the same facts. Someone came from outside of our reality, extraterrestrial, then came into our reality. If you reject the hypostatic union, if you take a more Gnostic view, Jesus was assumed by the God. Here are the extraterrestrial, and then went back up Gnostically, or body and soul, up into whatever. So, I mean, that's not back into extraterrestrial space. So, even though he's playing it like he's saying a crazy thing, remember what our claims are. Our claims are is that God himself sent his word, which is also him, with the help of the Spirit, which is also him. So his breath and his word came into the world, created the world, and eventually took incarnate human form, and then went back up to the right hand of the Father. But all creation is still being done through this one word. And while he's in heaven and he's away, the Holy Spirit, the Holy Breath, is still guiding us. And any allusion to the Spirit or to the Word being wisdom and being female is abrogated because people didn't understand that it was actually male, because it was just a female gendered word, but Jesus himself is male. That's our claim. So don't let this claim, being wacky, be a defense or but our claims are so much easier. No, we're both making huge claims. He's just making an opposite huge claim to mark us, and then you're missing the mocking.
Existed becomes more intelligible and more coherent with the surviving evidence. Well, yeah, I agree. Like, if the view is Jesus is E.T., then I can see why Jesus didn't exist would be a stronger view than that, but only because you have a ludicrously false kind of depiction of Christianity. And to defend this, he says, these Christians, and he's referring to people like St. Paul, who he quotes earlier, these Christians literally said that Jesus was an extraterrestrial who descended from the stars and there returned, that while on Earth, he merely wore a mortal human body like an environment suit he eventually discarded. No, that's just not at all, like, whatever you think about Jesus' existence or non-existence, the idea of the Christian message is Jesus wasn't fully human. He just wore a human suit and then discarded it. If you've watched my recent videos on Gnosticism, you'll know this was the very point that Christians were fighting.
Yeah, but there were a lot of Gnostics, and there were Gnostic Christians, and that's Carrier's point.
The Gnostics about. The Gnostics viewed the body as merely a cage or a prison that you would eventually be liberated from and discarded. The Christians defending the empty tomb are defending Jesus' bodily resurrection, that he doesn't just discard his body. He's not E.T. from outer space. He's God come into the world. And God isn't just like living among, that's not, every part of that is inaccurate or blatantly false. So that's Carrier. But besides him, you're more likely to find these kind of claims just kind of in pop culture, whether it's on Facebook or...
Again, Joe Heschmeyer is one of my favorite apologists in the world, and he's one of my favorite Catholic apologists in general, but he has a lot of flaws and a lot of limitations, and they're going to come out to light as he's trying to defend these arguments that, well, you'll hear it in his apologetics, which again, this is why I'm against apologetics.
On television. So for instance, Stephen Fry, who is smart in other areas, it was on the game show QI, explaining this very fictitious view that Jesus is just a retelling of the story of Mithras. And you often find this around Christmas time, but you'll hear variations of this claim.
There are amazing things claimed about Mithras, and I'll read you some of them. He was a savior, Mithras, sent to earth to live as a mortal, through whom it was possible for sinners to be reborn into immortal life. He died for our sins, but came back.
But see, this shows something else. So everything that he's saying here is wrong. But this shows something else, which means that you can be completely wrong and have bad sources, and yet report it as if it's true with complete confidence. Think about that, Mr. Apologist, Mr. Christian, Mr. Muslim, Mr. Hindu, Mr. Atheist, Mr. Skeptic. You can be completely wrong, and based on faulty sources, have the confidence to deliver the facts that are incorrect, the incorrect facts, as if they are true, and truly believe them as you're saying them. Remember that the next time you state something is true, that you could be wholly incorrect.
Back to life the following Sunday. He was born of a virgin on December the 25th in a manger or perhaps a cave.
Again, none of these are the facts of Mithras. None of these are the facts of any of the other gods. But he's delivering it with confidence because he's been told that it's true through sources that he trusts. The question then becomes, well, how do we know that the sources that we have, the church, the Bible, the writers of the Bible, the assumed authors of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Moses, Noah, that they're trustworthy? Let's pretend that every single book that's titled who it's from is actually from that person. How do we know that person's trustworthy? There's a lot going on here before you get to multiple authorships and retellings and rewritings and reworkings and everything else. Everything that's more complicated. Before you get to the translation issues, is your translator reliable? Before you get to any of that, any of the biases that you have to acknowledge, all the persons who authorship are attributing honest reporters, are they getting good information? Then if you cop to the fact, if you realize the fact, well, okay, so Moses couldn't write after he died, so someone else had to write this. Is this person getting the right story? Are the sources he's using reliable? So this becomes a much bigger deal. So yes, this guy trying to shit on Christianity and trying to make it sound like it's all made up is completely wrong. This mythicist is completely wrong. Stephen Fry is completely wrong. But it exposes a problem that Joe Heschmeyer has, which he showed this with purgatory. He saw that purgatory is mirrored or inspired by Jewish hell, and he tried to make a connection that didn't exist by using a bad, faulty source, which was the Jewish Christian Encyclopedia. They got a fact wrong, and when you went to the source that they referenced, the source actually said something completely different. So Just because you have a source that agrees with you or multiple sources that agree with you doesn't mean that you're correct. The sources themselves could be faulty.
Tended by shepherds and became known as the light of the world. He had 12 disciples with whom he shared a last meal before dying. His devotees symbolically consumed the flesh and blood of him. Because Mithras was
It is possible to be confidently wrong, confidently mistaken.
sun god, he was worshipped on Sundays.
Is he a tribute band?
He's often depicted with a halo around his head. And Mithraists gave each other gifts on December the 25th. The leader of the religion was called the Papa, and HQ
And
was
then
on...
think about how many people watched this that were then misinformed and then also believed this lie. And they said it to how many other people. Again, this is the perfect mirror for how bad information about Christianity could get out there, which is why we have to be careful about what we say about Christianity and why apologetics, done for apologetics' sake, when it's with propaganda and lies and salesmanship, is so dangerous, because you're now saying things the Bible doesn't say, and you're making connections that are not actually there. And these faulty connections, when exposed, will make people lose their faith, just as Bart Ehrman and other scholars, when they point out the falsities here, make Stephen Fry and other people like Hitchens lose credibility in the public eye.
Vatican Hill in Rome.
Now, almost everything you just heard there is blatantly and demonstrably untrue. And it should ring some alarm bells. If you know anything about Roman mythology, there's no soteriology where someone needs to die for your sins. That's just not how their whole religion works. Nevertheless, you'll find things like this Facebook meme where it says Mithras was born of a virgin on December 25th. He was considered a great traveling teacher and master. He had 12 disciples and he performed miracles. He was buried in a tomb. After 3 days, he rose again. His resurrection was celebrated every year during his principal festival held on what would become Easter. So you've got the Christmas version, you've got the Easter version of Mithras. They're both fictional. They're both invented by people who opposed Christianity. Or you'll find a version of this with Horus. Allegedly, he was also born of a virgin on December 25th. And I could point you to any number of Christians who would say none of this is true. I can point you to any number of scholars who would say this is untrue. I'm going to point you to someone I've spoken well of recently, twice in a row now, Bart Ehrman. He's an agnostic with atheist tendencies, but even he recognizes this is just ridiculous falsehood. So here's Ehrman just tearing this theory apart.
It is a modern myth that that there were lots of accounts of people being born of virgins and on December 25th, and that they were crucified and that they were
He was much younger here.
buried and raised from the dead. It's actually a modern myth. Those Mithras was not born on December 25th. His mother was not a virgin. Osiris is not raised from the dead. People say that, but
Again, the arguments that Heschmeyer is making might not be great, and they might be a little tired. But man, the clips he's picking, this video and the last video, are amazing. These are great clips. The clips do all the work for him, so he can be as incomplete and in... Oh, I had the word and then I lost it. This is the problem with dyslexia.
people who say that don't know the ancient sources. The ancient sources, in fact, don't bear that out.
Hilariously, a lot of this actually comes from what was originally an anti-Catholic polemic from Alexander Hislop's The Two.
And this is something I've brought up on my channel multiple times. A lot of the anti-Christianese, a lot of the Protestant beliefs, a lot of the pagan beliefs come from anti-Catholic propaganda and anti-Catholic polemics. The upside-down cross is not a sign of Satan. The pentagram is not a sign of witchcraft. These are Catholic symbols. They just are. The sideways cross is not an evil cross. It's the cross. It's St. Andrew's cross. Smoke and incense and wearing black is not worshiping Satan or Lucifer or anything like that. It's just Gothic Catholic fashion.
Two Babylons, which was allegedly about how, all those depictions of Mary holding her child, Jesus, that must be Isis and Osiris.
Halloween is just a Catholic holiday.
Or that must be Nimrod and his wife. Or it must be, anytime there's a woman with child, this must be a goddess.
And this is a mistake that one of my favorite book series, The Magicians, make. And in fiction, it's fun, it's cute, but in actuality, when people start taking their cues and their facts about history from fiction, it becomes a problem.
You couldn't just have a woman holding a baby. Obviously, if a woman's holding a baby, that must be paganism. And it's that level of logic where it's Why in the
Oh,
world
wow,
would we
he's
jump
really
to
offended. Did you
paganism
see that?
from this very Christian, very biblical idea that Jesus has a mother named Mary? And so this was extreme, like kind of fringe Protestant anti-Catholicism that then gets adopted by people who reject Christianity, and seemingly unaware that they're just repeating these 19th century falsehoods that no scholar takes seriously. And I'm going to go back to Ehrman because he pushes atheists on this by saying they're just regurgitating these embarrassing falsehoods.
I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. It is not an issue for scholars of There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field, who doubts that Jesus existed.
And that includes Carrier, by the way. As I say, he has a PhD, but I looked at his CV, and the closest he's got is lecturer, but if you read it, it says independent, which basically just means he's like doing this. He's going on YouTube channels, he's talking to people, or he's working for...
Technically, you're shitting on yourself now, but hey, whatever.
These groups like Partners for Secular Activism and CFI, it's called Center for Inquiry Institute. And he only did that for like 2 years. None of that is academic positions. None of this is him being in a position where he's in academia doing anything kind of peer-reviewed, proving his kind of work. The nearest he has is a little more than 20 years ago, he worked as a librarian's assistant. That's it. He's not an academic in this field working in academia. And I mention this because he constantly puts the PhD after his name and speaks of himself as a classicist. And people who don't understand academia can imagine that he has a degree of authority that he just does not have. He's a smart...
Wow. I wonder if any apologists do that. Like a guy named Dr. James White.
Guy on the internet with a crazy view. There are a lot of people like that on the internet. And if you say that, it's like, okay.
Why do I feel called out?
Okay, well, now you know to take it with more of a grain of salt. I mean, you could find plenty of people who've gone to school but still have weird views on relevant issues like religion or history. That just know that that's what you're getting. Now, I realize that doesn't automatically disprove it. And Ehrman acknowledged...
Technically speaking, Catholics also have a weird view of history. Protestants have a weird view to history. Any ideology warps your perception of reality.
Is that too. But he makes the case that if you're going to say the entire field is wrong, you'd better come equipped with evidence. Like, you'd better have some strong evidence to support you. I'm going to go back to Ehrman one last time because I like what he says here.
You know, if you want to go where the evidence goes, I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because, frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish.
So I applaud Ehrman, and I applaud those people who were literally applauding Ehrman, that there are atheists out there who realize this is an extreme kind of fringe view. But because there are enough people who are atheists who believe this kind of thing, it's worth just calling out like, oh yeah, none of that is true. Now, how do we know it's not true? How can we disprove this? Well, remember Richard Carrier, who I mentioned before is the most famous proponent of this? He actually, in a 2016 blog post on his own blog, he responds to a question that he says he gets a lot. And the question goes like this. I keep hearing Christian apologists insisting the Corinthian Creed, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8.
This is what we just watched on the previous one, even though it's a year ago. So the previous video that we just watched is from a year back, and this is from today. So that was the context for that.
Heavily dated to the 30s AD, just years or even months after Jesus died. Can you direct me to a solid refutation of that claim? And the answer is no, he can't, because there is no refutation of that claim other than a logically fallacious one. Because the evidence for the creed dating back to the very origins of Christianity is amply strong, and there is no reasonable basis for claiming otherwise. So we're going to get into what the Corinthian Creed is in a second here, but notice he's saying there's no reason to reject the idea that what we're about to hear in 1 Corinthians 15 dates to the earliest months or earliest years after the death of Jesus. And he says in particular that Paul doesn't appear to have written this. It has a non-Pauline style, particularly in the first 3 lines. And he's got textual criticism of some of the later parts. I'm only going to focus on the first 3 lines that he grants the authenticity of without an asterisk. And he says, this after this happened, say, yeah, Jesus existed. Like, how do you get to Peter, James, John, these other people before Paul? Like, I understand people who say, St. Paul didn't know Jesus.
Let me bring in a question here, which is, you're going to claim that Acts is historical. And I agree with you. But most scholars that I've read, in fact, I can't think of a scholar that I've read that isn't an apologist that thinks that Acts is historical. Most of the scholars that I've read think Acts is wholly, completely made up, completely unhistorical. The only apologists that I've read, the only writings that I've read that say it's historical are either study Bible material or Catholic or Christian apologists who state that then it's the most accurate, the most reliable source for history. So you either have people claiming it's the most reliable source who are biased, or you have people who are claiming it is the worst source who are biased the other way. So again, it's a question of how much do we trust the source. So we're going to trust the source of Corinthians. Okay. On a religious level, fine. On a secular level, on a scholarly level, on an academia level, what's your proof? You're not going to do that. You're just going to make the claim and move on.
And so maybe he was tricked about the whole thing. Maybe he had a delusional experience on the road to Damascus. And so he thought he saw the risen Christ. It was just a hallucination. I understand all of that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the 12 apostles. Because when Paul comes into the religion, there already is a religion. It already has a creed, this Corinthian creed in 1 Corinthians 15.
And this is my argument against Dan McKellen, which I know that everyone just popped out. I don't know why everyone popped out. Everyone was here a second ago, and then suddenly everyone popped out. But whatever. This is my argument against Dan McKellen. So with Dan McKellen, he's arguing, well, the creeds and everything developed afterwards. And this is why we're late dating the Gospels and everything else. I say the reason for the late dating and the reason why you see the seeds of these theologies and dogmas in the Bible, especially the New Testament, is the fact that these things developed in the intertestament period between the events of Jesus' life and the writing down in the communities of Christians. So these early Christian communities, when they wrote these things down, the dogma developed with these traditions. What are the traditions? The Gospels. I guess that has to include Acts.
And that creed clearly says Jesus lived, died, and rose again. That doesn't sound like a myth. Now, you could say the apostles are lying. That's a different question. But to say that this was a myth, that Jesus never existed, is just bizarre. I mean, at most, we're talking maybe 3 years back. So imagine someone who said, oh no, COVID didn't happen. Like,
3 years back thing doesn't work. Let me look it up.
COVID didn't exist. That wasn't even a thing. That's further back than Jesus' death and resurrection was from the Corinthian Creed and Paul's conversion. So you can see why, like, you can't just build up a myth. You can make up a story about, like, oh, there was a terrible plague in the 19th century, and most people wouldn't know better. Or you could say this, Paul Bunyan or somebody existed in the 19th century. That's far enough back, you can make up a myth. It's very hard to make up a myth about someone you say was publicly executed and then rose again and appeared to hundreds of people just a few months or years after it allegedly happened. So it doesn't work as a myth. It doesn't even really work as a lie.
So
but that's
1 Corinthians is dated between 50 and 58. So that is not 3 years after Jesus' death. That is 20 years after Jesus' death, 30 years after Jesus' death, if you want to go with the late dating. So just FYI, there you go.
That's Carrier's view. The other reason that we can, and notice Carrier has to acknowledge the Corinthian Creed is authentic, because you just can't.
Eventually, the apologists are going to have to start going with the scholarly consensus of the dating. Otherwise, they're just going to look like liars. That doesn't mean they can't defend early dating, but they have to do what Jimmy does, which Jimmy Akin actually gives a defense of why his early dating is what it is. If you're not going to do that, if you're just going to say the consensus is this, then you're going to have to go with what the consensus currently is, and the consensus no longer matches the dates that you're giving. Unless you want to say and do caveat upon caveat and just be like, the consensus among Christian scholarship, the consensus among Catholic apologists is this on the dates. Otherwise, you have to stop saying what you're saying, because you're just lying. You know what the consensus is, and you're still reporting a previous date that has either been debunked or is no longer the consensus. To stop calling it the consensus. Say, in my opinion, was written at this time.
Can't deny it on historical grounds. But the other place to turn is to the Roman historian, Tacitus. And Tacitus, he's born in the mid-1st century. So he's born around the year 50 or so, I believe.
I have him written. I have him right there. I have Tacitus right there, somewhere right there. Right there. Where are you? You're somewhere there.
maybe 56. And he's a young boy in the year 64 when there's the Great Fire of Rome. And later, as an adult, he's writing a history of Rome. And he talks about how after this happens, people thought Nero, the emperor at the time, had caused the fire himself so that he could expand his own properties. And so Nero, to deflect criticism, fastened guilt and started torturing a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Now, notice here, Tacitus is not a Christian. He's not sympathetic to Christianity, but he's describing how, when he was a boy, in the 60s, there were a group of Christians who were tortured and killed by the Emperor Nero. And
I've heard someone try to debunk the claim that Nero actually made this claim. I don't remember the argument anymore, though. But I've heard some scholars try to debunk this accusation of Tacitus against Nero, stating that Tacitus had a bias against Nero.
Goes on to say that Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, obviously crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So he's acknowledging, Tacitus, who's not even a Christian, is acknowledging that Jesus of Nazareth, this Christus, historically existed. He's not endorsing Christianity. He doesn't believe the whole thing. He calls it a most mischievous superstition and talks about how it spread from Judea to Rome, where all things hideous and shameful eventually arrive. This is classic, Roman kind of lamenting the city that they grew up in. But he goes on to describe how the Christians suffered these really barbaric forms of martyrdom. They were covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn apart by dogs, they were nailed to crosses, they were doomed to the flames and burnt, and they were used as human torches. The point there is, the Christians in the early 60s were in a position to know whether the whole thing had just been like a fun story they were talking about or a real event. And if it's just like a fun story...
Are they? Especially if they're in Rome, they were not at the events. All they have is the reports. So they might truly believe the reports, but that doesn't mean the reporting is true. So we have evidence of a man who died, and evidence of believers who believed, and evidence of their disciples and students converting and proselytizing and willing to suffer martyrdom for what they think is the truth of those beliefs. And even if they're not willing to suffer martyrdom for those truths, they're still suffering martyrdom for them because they're being persecuted. So it doesn't even matter if they deny it, they're still getting killed, even if in some writings supposedly the denials will let them free. But once you're in that position, you're kind of done for. Unless there's historically viable records of people going ahead and submitting to the denial and somehow being free and living good, happy, carefree lives. I've never seen that, but then again, I've only seen Christian sources on this.
No one's going to be like, I'm such a big fan of the Marvel universe that I want to literally become a Human Torch. No, that is not a thing that's happening. Like, no one is saying, I'm going to be martyred because I really like this story. I really like this myth. No, the Christians, we have to just grant that the Christians in the early 60s being martyred for this clearly think this is real and were staking their entire life.
But again, this is only A, they're being persecuted, so it's slightly different. B, the persecution might not have been as bad as it's being reported. Let's not worry about that. C, it only proves that they believed, not that the thing that they believed in was real, especially if this is 20 years, 30 years after the death of Jesus. It's a big gap. It's not a little gap. Let's see. When was Nero's persecution of the Christians? I hate this thing. When was Nero's persecution of the Christians? So 64. So 30 years. 30 to 34 years. Let's say 31 years. This is 31 years after Christ. If I'm talking about people that lived 31 years ago, I'm 40. But if we're talking about, let's just say, 31 years before I was born, I got no clue. I have to trust my parents' retelling of my grandparents' telling of a story. or someone who knew them's telling of a story. So I have no direct source. Or if I do have a direct source, if I was there, but it's 31 years ago, ask me about a conversation I had 31 years ago. I don't know. I'm guessing. I'm feeling things in. Some stuff I can remember really well. Some stuff, who knows? And if you ask me a question about like a friend, an acquaintance in a class that I never actually talked to, how would I know? So yeah, this is not a great defense. This is a great defense that the people who believed truly believed. That's, yep, sure. This is not proof of the event actually happening.
Their salvation on. And we have to grant they're so early on that there are eyewitnesses who are still alive. This is 30 years, right? This is as far back as the mid-90s are to us. And so if you know a bunch of people heard your story, mistook it for real.
Is that right? Am I that old? Let me see. See, it's 2024 minus 30. 1994. Let's see, 1993. Yeah, I can remember 1993 really good. I'll give him that. I remember 1993 really well. I remember 1994 a little bit hazy, but 93 I remember really well. So, okay, I'll give him that. I can definitely recall some conversations I had in 1993 when I was 13.
And then are getting like violently murdered. Wouldn't you be like, hey, guys, that's not a literal thing. That's just like a fun story we tell around the campfire. So it doesn't work, right? The whole mythic theory in this form that Jesus never existed, it was just mythology, just doesn't make sense of why the Corinthian Creed exists or why the early Christians are being martyred. And I'm just using this example in Rome because it's a very well-established one, but there are plenty of martyrdom accounts from even before this, of people being martyred in places like Jerusalem. And so they knew becoming Christians...
But again, this only proves that people believed. It doesn't prove that the event they believed in happened. And again, we can surmise that the crucifixion is real, but that doesn't get you to the resurrection being real. The resurrection being real is a belief. This is literally a leap of faith. This is the literal, real dividing line. So, yeah, as Christians, we believe the resurrection is real because we believe Jesus is God. We believe in the Trinity. If you don't believe those things, you can still believe Jesus existed and not believe that he was God. Which is kind of the point. So you're kind of missing the point to fight a straw man of a thing that's been debunked, which is mythicism.
They would die. It doesn't make sense to do that for a fun story. It does make sense to do that for the Messiah, who you believe.
If this was the internet of 10 years ago, if this was the YouTube of 10 years ago, fine. Great video. Let's do this. This is the internet of today. So the fact that you're putting an hour worth of material debunking mythicism, dude,
is the one who holds the keys to heaven and hell. So which one did they believe? It's very clear from both what they said and how they behaved. So that's the first theory, that Jesus never existed. The second theory is that there was some kind of rabbi named Jesus, but he was transformed into a Greek demigod. And unlike the first theory, this one actually...
I was going to say, this one is popular among MythVision hosts currently.
It has some scholarly support.
And guests.
Namely, a figure named Dennis MacDonald. And Dennis MacDonald has written many, many books related to this subject, including books like the Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark, or the book Luke and Virgil, where he claims... Luke...
I don't like what he's picking here, but what he's picking here... Oh, here, we'll get into it. Where is it? So what he's picking here as an example isn't a great example. So he's, even though this is directly from MythVision, he's picking one of the worst examples, which is... and I'll sum it up. There's a... In the Odyssey is one of my favorite books of all time. I've read multiple copies of it. I've listened to multiple copies of it. I haven't refinished it after that first time. The first time I read it all the way through. Since then, I've just kind of samples and selections, right? But I love it. I've watched movies of it. I've watched books of it. Played video games of it, if you know what I mean. We created it in Rome Total War 2. The argument is that the poor stranger that gets blessed by his old nanny, which may or may not be a god incarnate in human form, is equivalent to the woman, the poor woman, wasting expensive salve or chrism on Jesus's feet, which stunk. And not Jesus' feet stunk, but the chrism stunk. And it was a vast expense wasted when the apostles get upset because they could have used this for the poor, and instead it was used for Jesus. He's like, no, this is a great thing because I'm about to die. But and they didn't get it. And so the argument over here is that, well, you have the miscommunication happening, which is the mystery with Jesus is that he's about to die, but no one understands. The mystery with Odysseus is that no one knows who he is, except for maybe his nurse, apparently, because he's in disguise. And Jesus is also in disguise as a human. So there's another parallel, right? And then the next parallel is that, well, Odysseus gets blessed. Here Jesus is getting blessed by the woman. A type of blessing before death. That's part of the ritual. Jesus is a stranger. He's representing Odysseus is also a stranger in his own town, so he's also a stranger. These are not great parallels. They're also not correct parallels. But in modern context, in modern writing, when people are using inspiration of Jesus to write a character, and they do this a lot, they use a lot in a lot of stories, in a lot of the heroic myths, they use Jesus as an archetype. They don't get the story correct. They just use certain themes and pull it out. And that's all that they're saying here is that they're taking certain Greek themes and then putting them into the Jesus story. So Heschmeyer is making too much hay out of a bad claim to where he himself is making a bad claim against the bad claim. Two wrongs don't make a right. You're not using logic here. You're just saying, hey, this is a bad claim, but I'm going to make what I'm saying so great that what I'm saying is also false. So your debunking isn't true either because you've overshot. You've done what you always do. You found the thing that you were looking for, and now you're going to exploit it, and you're going to exploit it to the point that you make it false by overstating what you found. And Joe Heschmeyer's biggest sin our fatal flaw when it comes to apologetics is overstatement.
By Eurycleia, Odysseus' nurse, who recognized the scar on his thigh while washing his feet in Odyssey 19.
Okay, so if you remember in the Odyssey by Homer, Homer is in his own house with his wife Penelope, but he's in disguise as a poor beggar. And his former nurse, when he was a small boy, she's now an old woman, washes him and recognizes a scar that he had from an earlier wound. And then she realizes who it is. And we're supposed to read that and read the following words from Mark and be like, oh, this is obviously mimetic. This is the same story being retold in a Christian way. And think about all the themes you just heard me describe and see if you hear literally any of those things. In Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 3, while he, Jesus, was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the jar and poured it over his head. But there were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment thus wasted? For this ointment might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they reproached her. But Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you will, you can do good to them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burying. That's an important one. We're going to get back to that. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Okay, so think about the details in Mark. Odysseus is in disguise. Jesus is not in disguise. Odysseus is in his own house. Jesus is not in his own house. Odysseus is having his feet washed. There is no washing of feet in Mark's version.
So this is a slightly incorrect understanding of parallels. Let me see, where are we? 16. It says 19. Let's see. Okay, 2:13. You want to see the spine? How many times I've read this? Okay, 2:13. Okay. So Odysseus was left in the hall, brooding over his vengeance with Athena in his thoughts. He spoke at once to Telemachus, his son, and gave him clear directions. All the arms must be put in the storeroom, he said. If anyone misses them and asks questions, answer as civilly as you can. I have put them away out of the smoke. You can see now that they are not what they were when Odysseus went to Troy. They are quite spoiled by the fumes of the fire. Yes, there is another thing I have just thought of. Suppose the wine should go into your heads, and you may quarrel together and disgrace your dinner and your wooing both. You know the saying, bear still in sight draws men to fight. Telemachus listened, and calling his nurse Eurycleia, he said to her, Nanny, shut up the women in their rooms. I am going to put away father's fine armory. All the things are hanging about neglected since he went away, and the smoke is spoiling them. I am not a child now. You know I want to put them away where the fumes and the fire will not reach them. The old nurse answered, Ay, my love, I only wish thy brush up thy wits to take charge of the house and all that's in it. Come now, who shall go fetch the light for thee? The maids might a done it, but thou mustn't move out of their rooms. The boy said, This strange man will do. No one shall be idle who touches my ration basket, if he has come from a far way off. The nurse did not understand the secret of what he said, but she locked the doors of the women's rooms. When Odysseus and his son sprang up, carrying away helmets and bossy shields and sharp spears, Pallas Athena went before them with a golden lamp and made a bright light. Telemachus said, O father, here is a wonderful thing which I see with my own eyes. Really and truly, I can see the walls of the rooms and the fine panels and the pine wood rafters and the lofty pillars, all clear to my eyes, as if a fire were blazing. Surely one of the gods who rule the broad heavens is in this place. Odysseus answered, Be silent. Check your fancies and ask no questions. This is the way of the gods who rule Olympus. Now go and lie down. Leave me alone here, for I want to tease the maids and your mother a little more, and she will ask me everything amid the showers of tears. So Telemachus went along the way under the torchlight to lie down in his own room, where he always used to rest. There he maintained until dawn, but Odysseus was left in the hall brooding over his vengeance and thinking of Athena's promise. Now Penelope came into her chamber, beautiful as Artemis or golden Aphrodite. A fine couch was put ready for her, a work of Ismanlos, the master craftsman, inlaid with spirals of ivory and silver. It had a footrest attached, and a thick fleece was laid upon it. There sat Penelope, while the maids came in and cleared away bread and tables and cups. They emptied the braziers with the floor, and filled them again with wood for light and warmth. Then Melitheo raided Odysseus once more. Still here, you are, stranger? Going to make yourself a nuisance all night, rolling about this house and ogling the women? Get out of this, you creature, and be thankful for your dinner, or a firebrand shall help you on your way. Odysseus frowned and said, My good woman, why do you attack me with such bitterness? Because I am dirty and ragged and go begging about the town? I can't help that. Beggars and vagrants are all like that. I had once a house of my very own in this world. I was happy and rich, and often gave to a homeless man, whomever he might be, and whatever he might have wanted. I had my thousands of serfs, and plenty of all that men enjoy when they have the name of riches. But Zeus Cronan brought me to ruin, for that was his will, no doubt. Some day, maybe, you will lose all finery, which now marks you out from the others. Maybe your mistress will take offense and vent her anger upon you, or Odysseus may come home, for there is room for hope still. But if he is really dead, if he will never come back, his son is here now, his son Telemachus, by Apollo's grace, and like his father. He will not fail to see it if one of the women takes liberties, for he is a man now. And you can already see the parallels here with Christ. So Telemachus is now Christ, and so is Odysseus is Christ, and Croesus is also representing the king in the parables told by Jesus. You have taking care of the poor and being sacrificing for the poor, and what it is to be a good king. And so what Carrier is doing is making connections between this telling, this version, meaning this chapter's version of the Odysseus myth, somehow influencing or having parallels with the Christian myth. The problem with Christian mythos being tied to this is that Christian mythos comes out of Judaism. So even though, you can see the parallels, throughout the world. Again, you can go to Taoism and see Christian parallels. You can go to Confucianism and see Christian parallels. That's why the Catholic Church says there's truth in all religion. All religion contains some truth, but only one religion contains the fullness of truth. But if you look at it from a secular point of view, we're all playing with the same data. And by playing with the same data, we're looking at the same results. So therefore, we would have similar moral lessons in our holy books because we're all examining the same human nature and we're all contrasting it with the same animalistic nature. That's what's happening. So of course, it's going to have similar themes because the lessons are universal. Penelope heard this and scolded the woman. You may be sure, you bold girl, that I notice your impudence. You shall wipe it off on your own head. You know perfectly well, I told you myself that I was going to question the stranger, and here in the hall about my husband, for I am sorely distressed. Then she called to the housewife, Eurynomé, fetch a chair and lay a rug on it for me and for the stranger. Let him sit there and tell his tale and listen to me, for I want to question him. The housewife hurried off and brought the chair and the rug, and Odysseus patiently seated himself. Then Penelope spoke. Stranger. And notice that you can insert a crowd of people listening, and then you can insert a crowd listening to the story being told about this happening. But there is no crowd. That's kind of the point. You're the audience. So this is not parallel great with the apostles or with their later disciples. But again, that's the argument the carrier is making. Stranger, she said, I will begin myself by asking you this question. Who are you? What is your country and your family? Odysseus must have all his wits about him now. He begins as follows. My lady, no one in this wide world could find fault with you. My name resounds to the heavens, like your name resounds to the heavens, like the fame of a noble king, a God-fearing man who rules over the mighty nations and upholds justice while the black soil yields him barley and wheat. His trees are heavy with fruit, and sheep wean their young unfailing. The sea provides fish, for he is a good ruler. Again, this parallels with the good king. This has sheep, because the Greeks are also shepherds, so you have the Israeli shepherds and you have the Greek shepherds. You can see where someone's trying to force parallels that don't really exist. These are just cultural parallels. And again, this is something that Heschmeyer is not acknowledging at all. And the people prosper under him. Then ask me anything else, and you will. Now, I am in your house, but do not ask my family and my country, and fill my heart yet more with sorrow when I remember. This is in my own, a prophet in his own town is neither respected, nor honored, nor believed. This is Jesus is a stranger in someone's house. Here, Odysseus, even though Heschmeyer is saying, "Oh, he's the king of the house, so this is his house." No, he's playing the stranger. God knows all. Therefore, Odysseus is the king, and he's representing kind of a godly power. Athena is with him. She is a goddess. She's a goddess of war. She's on his side. That's kind of like the Holy Spirit, if you will. So these are the parallels that are trying to be drawn out, that again are not there, but are interesting, that Joe Heschmeyer is simply denying without any examination. I am a man of many sorrows. Come on. You can't tell me you can't see the Christian parallel there. I am a man of many sorrows, the man of sorrow. I'm a man of many sorrows, but I must not sit grieving and lamenting in another man's house. Eternal lacrimation is a sorry occupation. The servants might not like it, nor you perhaps yourself. They might think me a drunken man, all aloft in tears. Ah, no, said Penelope. All my comeliness and my good looks are gone. The immortals took them from me when the army embarked for the war, and my husband with them. If that man would return and care for me, my name and fame would be better for it. But now I am in distress. See what troubles fate has poured down upon me. All my chief men of the islands, from Dilicon to Same to woody Sekothos, and all my neighbors in Ithaca, want to take me for a wife against my will, and they are wasting my house. And again, you can see parallels here to the Proverbs. Not Proverbs. Sorry. I lost the word. Parables. So I take no heed of strangers. And remember that all of this is a story within a story within a story, for the way that Odysseus works. Although this could be the actual story. So I take no heed of strangers. Our supplements are public heralds with their messages. But I pine away with longing for my husband. These men are in a great hurry, but I wind my schemes on my distaff. First there was the shroud, some kind of spirit put into my head and set up a web on my loom, a great web of my finest thread. Then I said to them, my good young men, you want me for a wife now? Odysseus is dead. And you can see parallels here with the resurrection, parallels here with the shroud of Turin, or the shroud that Jesus wipes his face with. I'm going to stop after the next part because this is going kind of long. In a hurry, but wait until I finish this cloth, for I don't want to waste the thread I have made it for. This is to be a shroud for my lord Lythrides. When the fate of Dolorous death shall take him off, I should be sorry to have scandal among our women if he should lack a shroud, when he had all those great possessions. And again, Jesus doesn't have any great possessions. Jesus is a homeless wanderer. So, again, the parallels don't exactly work. I could keep reading, but we kind of get the point. I wanted to get to the point where the maid... Let's see. Faithful Penelope. Penelope replied, my dear guest, my son and my daughter. The young man, the guest. Yeah, okay. We're good there. Okay, you get the point. The parallels are not so clear or so obvious. We'll go a few minutes more and then we'll go ahead and stop because I got to sleep.
There's a recognition because of a wound. There's nothing like that in Mark's version. Strikingly, I mentioned MacDonald this is all a quotation from Bruce Loudon, and I went and found Bruce Loudon's book, and there's hilariously this footnote that MacDonald cuts out, because Loudon says in his footnote, MacDonald pursues tenuous parallels between Euryclea's bathing and anointing of Odysseus in 3 episodes in Mark. Literally, the book he's citing to about how these are so connected mentions in a footnote how he's pursuing these weak, tenuous parallels. Like, that's what tenuous means. These are weak connections. This is not a strong case, and yet we're to believe this is this strong, irrebuttable case. Now, I think MacDonald can persuade a lot of people because there's a few things that he does. And I'm not saying he necessarily does them intentionally, but he does them in such a way that you can miss some really important, which is that she recognizes him by his scar. So MacDonald acknowledges this.
Euryclea's recognition.
I don't think anyone seeing that on its own would be like, oh, obviously, the anointing in Mark 14 must be a retelling of Odysseus being...
That isn't what pneumatic means. It's like it's in the sauce. It's in the air. When we watch anime, whether it's Evangelion, or we watch a movie like Star Wars, there are clear parallels to Christ. That doesn't mean that they're copying the exact same story beats. They're just putting this stuff in there. It's in the mix. It's in the sauce. That's the argument for a pneumatic retelling, is that it's pulling the same themes. Now, again, I don't think the Odyssey influenced the events of Jesus' real life, but it's possible that it influenced the writers of the Gospels when they were putting together Jesus' life, and they might have been looking for parallels of how to write something similar if they were familiar with Homer, which there's no guarantee they were, but if they were, okay. So if I'm telling a story about my own life, about things that really happened, and I want to try to communicate something, and I've read enough books and I've watched enough movies that I can make a reference, or that I can use a theme or use a setup to show this thing, that's me using a pneumatic reference. I'm using the stuff that's in the culture to explain. I have a strong sense of freedom, so therefore I couldn't bend my will to this thing. Okay, well, that doesn't make sense in a Chinese culture, but my independence and my freedom and my expressing my right to speak or my right to bear arms or my right to anything that's in the Constitution makes a lot of sense to a fellow American reader. Okay, but I'm pulling that from the culture. I'm pulling that from the zeitgeist, if you will. I'm not actually referencing, I'm not making a direct parallel. If I, in the story of my life, to show that I'm honest, cut down a cherry tree, and then I tell my father that I did it, but let's say I change it to where now it's an apple tree. And instead of me telling my father, I told my mother. I'm still using the reference. I'm just changing some of the details to fit my story. Paul Bunyan, Pecos Bill. I can do this with a lot of stuff.
I didn't catch that.
That scared the crap out of me. Echo, stop. I can do this with a lot of stuff. I could reference other movies, other things that I'm into. I love Wolverine. I could, use a parallel between Wolverine and Sabretooth to describe a fight that I have with maybe my childhood rival. And I could use the same themes in the fictional telling of it. Or when I'm trying to tell how it really happened, but I'm missing some details, I can use details from fictions that make sense. So that's the argument. The argument is that there's parallels. Do I think those parallels are direct? No. But do I think that it's possible that the writers were influenced by them? Sure. They're telling the story 30 years later. Possibly they might not even be the original tellers. The original apostles may have already been dead. So the original person who told the story could have been dead by the time that the story was actually written down. In fact, their death or martyrdom could have been the impetus to write it down so we don't lose what it is they told us. Oh, that's plausible. That doesn't mean that's how it happened, but it's all plausible. So yeah, it's plausible that the Odyssey, the greatest story in Greek, influenced the Greek writers. So yeah, the Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Working Days, Theogony could have influenced the people who wrote it down in Greek. That's possible. That's not impossible. That doesn't mean that the parallels are direct, but it does mean that there's an influence there. It doesn't have to be overt. So even while I disagree with Carrier, I don't think Heschmeyer's argument is reasonable. He's not rebutting anything. He's taking it way too far.
Washed by his former nurse in book 19, because earlier in both Mark and earlier in book...
So let's say the thing with Jesus really did happen, because I believe it really happened. And then the writer who's writing about it in Greek, it might be thinking about how do I make this story make sense? And he might flash back to, hey, I remember being told this in a campfire. I remember going on a fishing trip and my father telling me this story. I think this does make sense. Let's add some flavor. Let's add some context by kind of making sure these connections work. Oh, well, what can I reference it against? I can reference against this thing, this event in the Odyssey. Again, do I think that's what happened? No. But is it plausible? Yeah. Does it somehow hurt the inspiration of the Bible? Not at all. Does it somehow make the Bible's telling of the event untrue? Not at all. But yeah, when retelling it, you might have been influenced or referencing, or might have had some reference to a popular fiction that everyone knew, or a popular telling that everyone knew.
Book 19, two people were amazed at something. Unrelated things, but they were both amazed by something. And then after that, the second parallel, Odysseus went to Penelope and sat, and then Jesus went to the Mount of Olives and sat. Actually, even a little misleading, because Penelope actually sits first. So,
again, I just said that you can play around with, when you're doing nometics, you can play around with events and order and all of that. So this is not a good argument against it.
Yeah. I mean, these are extremely forced kind of parallels. My point, though,
Not really.
is in his book, he highlights
forced.
several alleged parallels between these two passages. But the first, quite a few, let's see, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,
And
10.
again, I believe Jesus is real. I believe the Bible reports the truth. But I don't have any problem with the Greek authors being influenced by Homer. Okay, so the gospel writers were influenced by Homer. So what? That doesn't make the story untrue. It just means there might be some threads there that we can pull on to understand what they were trying to say a little bit better. Now, I've read the Iliad and the Odyssey. I've read a lot of it. I've read many versions of it, and I've read the Bible many times, and I've read the Gospels more times than I've read the Bible as a whole. So yeah, no, the parallels are not there. Not in the concrete way, explicit, obvious way that Carrier is trying to say. They're not there. But they might be implicitly there, subconsciously there, culturally there. That's fine.
I think the first
Narrative
10 or
writing
11
structure.
are not even from the passage he's allegedly looking at. They're just from earlier parts of Mark's Gospel and earlier parts of Book 19. When you're quoting Mark 13 and quoting the early parts of Book 19 of the Odyssey,
But there are themes. Like I said, helping the poor, being a good king. There are different parables that have parallels here. But again, that could just be cultural. That could just be Mediterranean culture. That could just be cross-cultural. It could be human nature being referenced here. You don't know. So don't downplay this that much. You're overplaying your card. You're playing your hand.
to say, look at these connections. In case the oil is highlighting what are the real connections between the two. And so I'm just going to run through them and point
I'm
out
going to play this part just because it's kind of interesting, and then we're going to call it a night.
that there's a stronger case to be made that JFK didn't exist. He's just a mythological retelling of Abraham Lincoln. Then there is a case that Jesus is a mythological retelling of Homer, or of Odysseus. So here are the statements, or here are the true statements about Kennedy and Lincoln. Number one, both of them were elected to Congress.
I think you might be missing the point of what they're trying to say. Although if they are truly saying what he's claiming they're saying, which is that Jesus is just a reinterpretation of or a retelling of Odysseus, then yeah, that's clearly false. I kind of got a feeling that's not what they're actually saying. I don't want to go back and watch this episode of MythVision because I think it's from an era of MythVision that I didn't particularly enjoy. So, But I got a feeling that Joe Heschmeyer's explanation of it is not the correct explanation of what they were trying. Is not the correct understanding of the point they were trying to make.
In 46. Lincoln was elected in 1846, Kennedy in 1946.
He has a habit of overstating things.
Both were elected to the presidency in 60. Lincoln 1860, Kennedy in 1960. Both have 7-letter long last names. Both were famously connected with civil rights. It'd be hard to find two people more connected with civil rights who were president. Lincoln liberating the slaves, and then Kennedy signing the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Fifth, both of them, while in their 30s, married women in their 20s. Sixth, both of them were shot on a Friday. Seventh, they were shot in the head. Eighth, both of them, when they died, were replaced by their vice president, who happened to be Johnson in both cases. Ninth, both of them had a security agent named William, who within 48 hours of attaining the age of 75 years, 5 months, died. Lincoln's bodyguard, William, and Kennedy's Secret Service agent, William Greer. Both of them were succeeded by Southerners, Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, Lyndon Johnson from Texas. Both of their successors had been born in 08. Andrew Johnson in 1808, Lyndon Johnson in 1908. Both of their successors had 6-letter first names in addition to having the same last name. Both of the assassins are known by 3 names, although they acknowledge that's pretty common. Both of their full names, John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, are both 15 letters. Both of the assassins committed the crime while in a place where they were regularly employed. Booth worked at Ford's Theater. Oswald worked at the Texas School Depository. And then finally, the mother of Ulysses S. Grant, who succeeded Andrew Johnson as president in 1869, was named Hannah Simpson Grant. The mother of Richard M. Nixon, who succeeded Lyndon Johnson as president in 1969, was named Hannah Milhouse Nixon. How could you deny these parallels, right? Like, obviously, this is a mimetic retelling. And I think the same person hears that and is like, yeah, I understand how probability works. There's going to be a certain number of things that are just coincidental. If you get a group of a couple dozen people, the odds that 2 of them have the same birthday is pretty high. I don't remember the exact number, but it's much lower than you would imagine before it's more likely than not that 2 people share a birthday. And so the fact is, like, ordinary people just often don't understand how probability works. And so a lot of what you're seeing, I think, in McDonald's work is he takes these things that only sound improbable if you kind of follow his charts in his rewritten
I was
versions.
saying Carrier. I might have needed to have been saying McDonald. To be fair, I'm really, really tired, but I know all the points that I made are still valid.
Of the accounts, and
But
don't.
every time I said Carrier, just put McDonald's name in there, and vice versa. And if it's another name, put that name in there. My point is the same. Heschmeyer has a tendency to overstate his case, which turns his very true observation into a very false one.
Don't look closely at what's happening, because if you do look at it, you're like, 2 people were amazed, 2 people sat down. This is
Correct, proper, brief, terse would be helpful things for him to learn how to do.
vaguer than the Kennedy-Lincoln thing, and we can safely discard the Kennedy-Lincoln thing as obviously not evidence of a real mimetic parallel.
Okay. Also, I think you might have a misunderstanding what the word pneumatic is. I'm exhausted. Let's do the outro, and I'll talk to you all tomorrow.
Is to be something, that's why I just keep on running. Can't stop what you don't see coming, yeah, and you know I'm coming. How can I trust you if you don't trust me? I do what I do, cause it is just me, and nothing is new. No, I'm not lucky. I work my ass off, so I'll be some. You either pick yourself up or you let yourself down. Life will always be tough, so who the fuck are you now? Will you make it alone, or do you need someone else? I don't need anyone, I'll do it all by myself. They say life will bring discomfort, and I discovered we all just suffer, cause no one feels that bad. And it comes from one another, we hurt each other just like a lover, and don't think twice about that. Yeah, and I feel like something's bad, but hell, I'm used to that. I always turn my back, yeah. And I wanna feel something, but all I feel is